what is training? Because am I a trainer? Am I this? Some companies say you dancers do daily training, some it's daily class, those subtle nuances in language. And I think that's where, going back to when I sort of came to coaching, it then really made me go back to kind of go, okay, so what am I doing when I'm teaching? What happens when people are training? There's elements of training, there's elements of teaching, there's elements of coaching, and there are elements of mentoring as well.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching. So in today's episode, I was joined by Dennie Wilson, who is a dance artist and educator at the Royal Academy of Dance. It was a really great conversation, quite alien to me insofar as starting to understand the world of dance and ballet, but also looking at it through the prism of coaching as teaching as coaching, and you might wonder what I'm getting at with that. But if you listen into the episode, we get into talking about the different roles within a space that we might call coaching, where at times we coach, at times we teach, at times we train. And each of those different roles that the leader would inhabit are going to come with implications for how we move forward in our pedagogy, how it's received by those that were, and different implications about the sharing of power and all those sorts of things. Now, Dennie came from a vocation or a sport or an art, whatever way you want to call it, that is it has a lot of tradition and a more directive approach to coaching. And actually, I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned in the evolution of dance and how it's moving into something that's more around the individual and around expression. But there's a lot that, even if you're in a sport that you feel already has that, there's still a lot that you can learn from this, particularly as we get into talking about the sort of underpinning assumptions there and some of the conundrums that we can get ourselves into, actually, for good reasons, when we start to try and piece together why we do things the way we do them. So really insightful. I think this is both for people who are in the dance world, but also for people who are outside of it, who want to get an insight into the way that dance is taught or coached, as I say. And there's a whole lot to take from it, from someone who's been in this space for so long and is a real veteran practitioner. So really, really great episode, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. So, Dennie, how are you? It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. I think I'm all right.
Yeah, I know.
Let me tell.
I think I need to say that anytime anyone asks me how I'm doing. I think it is. Everything's live. It's dynamic. So, obviously, we're going to chat about your paper today. Let's get into a wee bit of the sort of motivations behind the paper to start, because I'm always intrigued as to why someone, goes into the endeavour of actually conducting research or thinking things through at a deep level. And just considering this is positioned within dance, and it's a commentary piece, isn't it, on the state of dancing as a teaching or coaching process, depending on how we chicken or the egg, what comes first here. Why did you actually want to write this paper? Maybe we can start from there.
Yeah, it came out of my doctoral study. I think also, although it's this 2022, it's kind of written in 2020. Where we were in lockdown, although I think most of us, although we were in lockdown, we were working very hard from home. But I would have been at the point where I would have gone out to actually do some case study research within vocational dance training and professional dance environments. And of course, I couldn't do that. So I then had to think about what could I do? And obviously the ideas behind why I was going out to do the case study research and the data collection all came from, I suppose, that point where you're writing your thesis proposal for approval. So that part of getting that approval and all the ethics and things. And so I suppose it was a kind of discussion between myself and my supervisor in regard to what could I get on with, productively. And I suppose all of the things that are in the paper were in my head. So it was actually a really interesting process. And reading it back, I can recognize that in a way it enabled me to get everything that was in my head down into something that was visual. But also I think in the way that I write, I speak a lot out loud when I'm writing so that I hear what I'm saying. So I'm listening to myself differently, if that makes sense. And that kind of helps my questioning. So I think it wasn't that it was, I was motivated. I felt very strongly at the point, in terms of, I don't think anyone goes into PhD study lightly. You feel very strongly about something. And I felt very strongly about coaching and the role of coaching within dance, and also what was happening within the profession at the time, within vocational training and how things were evolving, and it particularly in the physiological side of dance science. But I just felt there was though there were papers and research, being done in relation to the psychological side of the dancer, that was related to teaching. It wasn't related to coaching. The coaching strand from me came from engaging with coaching from a very different perspective, not coaching within dance, but actually coaching within the business world.
Okay.
Quite by accident, finding myself on a performance coaching sort of training program. Yeah, a couple of days of EPD, I suppose you would call it. And wanting to find something to engage with, and seeing something on performance coaching. And my head was in, okay, dance performance and coaching, and then went along and found myself in a room with many people that were in charge of or working in HR departments. And it was about different sorts of, or a different approach, coaching through a different lens.
Do you find when you're sometimes outside of that sort of bubble, and this isn't even just the bubble of dance or even coaching, but just in a business world, or it's not even, just outside of sport or physics, it'll be interesting the way people approach things that could be completely different to how you view things, just in the sense that it no longer is an embodied thing or anything that we have to relate back to how we move physically, isn't it? That's quite cool in a sense. There must be a lot of abstraction as well you're having to kind of move through and then transfer back.
Yeah, I think for me it was a real, because I've worked as a professional dancer I worked for so long, and a freelance dance artist. So, I was with companies, I was with this, I was with that. I was going from one thing to the other. It was also, it sounds strange, but it was a real, at such an advanced age, it was a real kind of insight into the way that organizations and companies that aren't necessarily artistic, small companies or working within the freelance or how they are actually structured in regard to looking after employees and overseeing employment and development. So it was a real, oh, right, okay, I've been off doing this for the last 30 years, but, people in other worlds, and of course there are so many worlds, it was really interesting to kind of go, oh, right, okay, this is how this world, approaches this. But I think what I really enjoyed was actually how welcome these 9 other people made me feel when you're all kind of introducing yourself. You realise you come from a completely different environment. But
so what makes you then, so when you're talking about different worlds then, so what, in terms of leading us back to the central premise of your actual doctoral thesis and the research and your applied practice, have you had a sense of feeling like you're in 2 different worlds, or has dance been positioned for a long time as a teaching activity or as a coaching activity? How can we, if we want to now kind of build a bit of momentum in that space around, helping us understand the rationale for the work, be quite intrigued to know, and I think for listeners who maybe aren't in dance, but also those who are, to get your perspective on the history of dance as a pedagogical practice, maybe not as a coaching practice, and then we can move into that.
Yeah. Well, I think what came from those 2 days is I had to do some written work, and somehow it introduced me to the book, The Inner Game of Tennis, which I think most sports people, and I was and I loved tennis when I was a teenager. I'd spend, hours in the back garden with a brick wall, sort of fantasizing that I was at Wimbledon Sort of, I was reading the Galway's words and then just kind of thinking, okay, hang on a minute. I find this really interesting. How does that work in dance? Where you're talking about not giving instructions, but being aware, not giving technical instructions, giving awareness instructions. And I really started, it really made me think about my own practice where I had definitely followed that tradition of being a professional dancer and in a way falling into teaching. I was interested in teaching. I've always enjoyed working with people. I was in companies where, as well as performing, we deliver workshops in the community. So teaching has always been part of my world as well, even from that kind of tradition of being a 13-year-old helping their ballet teacher with younger children as well. So I found myself thinking, okay, how might this work in dance? And really questioning the fact that, I feel like, but I have to give technical instruction. That's my job. And the Royal Academy of Dance, where I am now, I got permission to develop a small research project with some students who I took it from the perspective of block. And again, over time, when I've worked in vocational training, you hear teachers talking supportively about a particular student where they're saying, I'm saying this and I'm saying this, and someone else is saying, I'm saying it as well. And nothing is happening. And so I approached it from working with students who also felt that they were receiving feedback from teachers, a number of different teachers. They were receiving the same feedback, but somehow they weren't, and whilst they understood the feedback, and understood what they should be doing, they weren't progressing. Something wasn't being successful. So I developed a small research project, and some students who were feeling like that volunteered. I think I called it sort of coaching the inner game of dance, or dancing the inner game, or something. I can't remember. It was probably 2018-19. And I didn't know the students. I didn't teach them at the time that we were doing the project. And I did devised a number of one-on-one sessions with the students. And going into the studio, sort of saying to myself, right, Dennie, you're not allowed to give technical advice. Oh, how does that work? And so it made me really examine my practice and the way that I worked with. Did I speak at, the amount of information that I was giving, rather than what could be drawn from, what could be discussed, how could I help students discover? And so went in, guided by the inner game of tennis and devising some awareness instructions. And I was absolutely amazed at how quickly the students came back. We did, I think it was an intervention every 3 weeks, and in them between, they were reflecting on their other classes. And when they came back after the first intervention, just how quickly they felt they were making progress.
And how do you think that was, why would that struck you as a surprise? Is that due to the traditional elements of how dance is normally taught, or is it the curated sort of theme of dance in the way that, one of the things that I found intriguing then when I was reading your paper was it is interesting, and I think you've done such a superb job of communicating just the language that's used, despite the fact we're dealing with humans, with people, because there's things like performances are like curations, and I found that strange as a word to pick up on. Like how you hear these words that you would think are more to do with an artifact of some sort, but it's like the performance is done through the athlete or the dancer, rather than the dancer creating a performance. And I just wondered if that went hand in hand with now this new approach where actually you're reversing it and the dancer's creating the performance.
Yeah, I think it's what became really clear, because I interviewed, I spoke with the students to begin with to ask them about what they understood about how they learned, what sort of learners they were, how did they process information. And it just became so apparent, and it's so interesting, dance is such a physical form. And when we talk about flow state, you want to be in this moment where nothing is interfering. And I think every dancer has experienced that at some point, and they're, like the Holy Grail, you're then kind of like, oh, you're searching for it again and again. But I was absolutely amazed, shocked isn't a word, because I can identify that. But I think what was interesting was observing the dancers, student dancers, describing what was going on in their head whilst they were trying to apply what they would refer to as a correction. I would try and, say feedback. And, in maybe 1-2 second window of time, they would be thinking a myriad of things. Arm here, head there, eyes here, breathe, foot, where is this placement, that placement, the other place, so many things. And observing the students, listening to themselves explain that process. And there was points where we just kind of look at one another and go, that's an awful lot to be thinking about.
Does that go against as well the state of automaticity, your fluidity you want to see in a dance performance? It's probably not meant to be so constrained. Probably. Well,
I think it's also, and this goes, but when I was saying, but how can I not give technical instructions? If I see something, then I should give feedback. That's my job. That's my role. And actually, if I don't notice it, then that's terrible, So I think there's all those kind of perfectionist things that come in from dance in terms of the way that you approach teaching. But it then became sort of talking with the students. Okay, well, what are you aware of? What are you aware of? And when they were doing all of that, they were kind of like, well, I'm aware of my thought process, not aware of their physical being, aware of their thought process. And then trying to make that thought process physical. So we then worked on, it was then, okay, well, we know that you're locked in this, and this is to do with maybe they keep getting feedback about control of turnout or strength of standing on the supporting leg or the position of their pelvis where their lumbar spine is kind of arched. So they're not, use your core, do this, lengthen, all of these things in terms of correct pelvic alignment.
Yes.
So it was then talking with them about, there are all of these different things that you're thinking about. One of those, could you think, which one, just one thing, would you pick that you think, think, and again, that's you think, that you feel, that if you're thinking about or, being in your physical body, which one of those might work? It was a process of trial and error. But then also trying to think about, not thinking about what to do, but thinking about what to be aware of.
Okay.
So it might just have been, be aware of what you're seeing in the space. It may actually be that they wanted to work on that, where the placement of their working leg, in terms of turnout, in terms of the leg, if they were at the bar, or if they were doing a pirouette, or if they were trying to do an arabesque and a penche, where the leg is going up and they're thinking about height and balance. Maybe actually just be aware of where you're looking or aware of where you're breathing.
And can they be given any autonomy about how to decide on what to look for? Or is that probably still on the part of the dance teacher if we're trying to apply this new approach to guide them in the right direction? Because I'm curious on that, because it seems like you're opening up a lot of other senses that allow for more individuality maybe in the training.
And I think that's a really good question, because there I was working one-on-one, and it was very much not part of their degree study, their technique class, where they would generally be in a class with maybe 15, 20 other students. So again, that question. So in that environment, it was very much, there was dialogue and discussion and looking at, and, the questions that I was hopefully asking the students that provided options for them to make a decision on. But when I then kind of, it's like the genie's out the bottle now. I can't put it back in when I go back into a technique class where I'm working with, 15, 20 students. I can't go through that process at all, one-on-one. I can't do that with 20. So how do I actually do that when I have a class of 15 to 20? And that's where I'm continually evaluating, working around, also making decisions about when I'm going into class, where I might be involved in teaching, because I'm thinking of this process as being a coaching process. So where I'm teaching, where I loosely think of teaching as where I may be going in and setting. I teach contemporary technique rather than ballet. Ballet, there's a codified language. If someone wanted to say first position, 2 demi-pliés, a rise, a full plie, and a full port de bras, every advanced dancer would know what would happen, and they'd know what the rhythm of that was. So what would be maybe new about that would be the order in terms of, with contemporary, I'd be going in with maybe teaching a new exercise or a new sequence or a new enchaînement that the dancers have not seen before.
So it's teaching, so in your language, teaching, well, I want to get clarity here first, and I'll actually come back to something you said just previous, but with teaching, it's about new stimulus, it's like new information introduction versus maybe coachings where they've already established an understanding and a performance.
So with the teaching, it is new information, it may be new sequences, but based on information that students already have. So they know what a plie is, they know what a forward port de bras is, or it may be, in terms of in the contemporary field, actually something that they don't know, or, in the way that I'm constructing an exercise, we may be working on the use of the back. And for a few weeks, we may have done the exercise in a particular way, and then I'll set a new exercise that explores the use of the back in a different way. But they have an understanding, or that.
Do you know what I found really helpful when I came across that, when you introduced me to that sort of terminology, Dennie? It's got me to think, and it's something I've thought about for a little while, but it definitely reminded me of this, about not just how the language you use impacts your athletes, but how it impacts your coaching process, or your process, structural process, whatever, because teaching carries with it connotations that have a little bit more to do with understanding the fundamentals of things, or actually behaviourally have a lot more to do with patience, encouraging patience on your part, maybe in terms of how you're working with people. Coaching, if we separate coaching as a way of introducing still to coaching, as a way of actually refining or at least directing the use of established still, or the use of an established schema or framework or something that's an athlete or dancer knows about, creates for quite a useful sort of progression of thought, which then in turn influences behaviours. Because I think, obviously I'm still a little bit into my own world of coaching here, but a lot of coaches just find coaching in a very unidimensional, like that's what coaching is, and it's always about refinement. I don't think a lot of coaches like to call themselves teachers at any point, whereas actually I think they could do with calling themselves teachers more. And now I know dance is the opposite, because you think dances, they need to call themselves coaches more maybe. But it got me thinking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yes, where I've kind of come to with this kind of dialogue in my head is that, yes, when coaching is going on, you may be working with something like, in dance, where there is a tradition of coaching, is where coaches are working with dancers who of repertoire that is known. They know the repertoire, but they're kind of looking at developing the dancer's performance of that repertoire. So it is about discovering that the coaching process is bringing about a new discovery for the person who is the dancer. And a new discovery for them through not old knowledge, but current knowledge, and through the lived experience of, we then go to training. What is training? Because am I a trainer? Am I this? Some companies say you dancers do daily training, some it's daily class, those subtle nuances in language. And I think that's where, going back to when I sort of came to coaching, it then really made me go back to kind of go, okay, so what am I doing when I'm teaching? What happens when people are training? So we call vocational training. You go into vocational training. And I just became really a bit sort of overthinking about even wanting to label myself as one or the other. And came to the point where it was like, well, what am I? Who am I? But, in terms of, it is the overarching terminology and educator, where within, underneath that, there's elements of training, there's elements of teaching, there's elements of coaching, and there are elements of mentoring as well.
Yeah.
Depending, if I'm I'm managing a program where I've got fellow professional dancers, although they are on an educational program, there will be elements of mentoring that go on there as well.
But I think, as much as it's uncomfortable sometimes for the practitioner to need, just as you've already said, that it makes you get a bit, it's a lot, it can overload you a little bit. But again, I think maybe, if you can forgive me for using coach as an overarching word I'm going to use here, but coaching is meant to be dynamic and fluid towards different situations. And if we only think of coaching in one way all the time, or at least if we're too hell-bent on maintaining that word, and I know some people might listen to this and they might wonder, is this just about semantics? But it's not just, it is and it isn't. It is about semantics in terms of the different meanings of the word, but the meaning of the word isn't just an exercise in semantics, it's an exercise in reflection and progression, because we can compartmentalise more elements of our practice, can't we, and get better and more elements of our practice if we actually recognise that there are multiple elements of what we do and multiple versions of what we do. Because I think with you, Gib, it's almost like it's like a parallel universe. I'm thinking of it like that, because I'm thinking as a coach, I could be training, coaching and teaching at different times for different groups in different ways.
Yeah, and I, as you were saying that, I was writing down the word values, and I think that, every educator, every coach, every trainer, every teacher, however they define themselves or wish to be defined, or however they look upon themselves, that will be supported by their own values, a set of values that will have been nurtured, that kind in terms of who they have encountered as educators in their journey. And, I certainly look back at, and I think everyone does, those sort of key people in your lives at certain points that may have said something or said nothing, but the behaviors, they may be great behaviors, or actually that they may have been not very good behaviors, but that have caused me, I can see myself at points in my vocational training or my professional career, performing career, or in the studio with students, that are in a way sort of, crystallizing experiences where it's something to think about, well, what does that mean for me? Yeah. How does that align with my values of how I want to be treated, and therefore how I want to treat other people? And of course that will have come from how I've been treated. Sorry, I may have gone off.
Yeah, but on that point, no, it's absolutely bang on, Dennie. But the next question I have then is, like, the fact that, like, we understand that we're not just a product of ourselves, we're a product of interactions, or we're a product of our brilliant biographies, the people we meet. Has that probably both served dance, but also maybe been an issue within dance? Because one of the things that stood out to me, and it got me, and what resonated for me, and someone who also coached a different sport, and I think every sport fights this in its own way. I think it's a demon that we all fight. It's the reproduction of knowledge, but not necessarily the advancement of it. Now, obviously, we can extend that. And within dance, what I'm trying to say there would be, at least the way I interpreted your paper, was that dance has always been taught one way, or instructed, whatever we want to call it, but it's been practiced in one way, and the aim seems to be to continuate and perpetuate the status quo. But that is probably now, is that clashing heads with more, is that a contemporary thing now that dance is becoming more diverse and it's maybe calling in more creative thought? Are we actually currently maybe not preparing dancers or artistic, students to actually evolve and be modern? Or are we just reproducing the traditional thing in a modern age? And is that what you're fighting against?
Yeah, I think it kind of depends. Where a lot of pedagogical, sort of research has been done in dance has been in the higher education sector, where there's more time in the studio, or as, the studio as laboratory. Whereas I think when you're in the vocational training sector, where it is about, okay, students are here, the aim is they get jobs in, companies, and with, those vocational schools are judged on that. There is, a curriculum, there is this to get through, there's that to get through. There is a perceived issue with time. And having the time to work in the studio in a more, and I'm talking more about technique. I think when you go to choreography, particularly if it's developing of new choreography, then the studio does become more of a laboratory. But within the training room, the studio, where you're actually developing the technique of the dancer, and I don't mean just the physiological technique, but their holistic technique, because that is the thing that the dancers take with them into the choreographic studio realm, whether that is choreograph in terms of developing new work or choreographic in regard to learning repertoire, but that kind of taking that to then the output, which would be the public performance. So I think where there's most tension in the vocational sector, and certainly through discussions that I have with people, my students, people that I meet, professionally, is that tension of the demand on them to be including this in a class, and actually being able to apply pedagogical approaches that are not just that traditional autocratic dynamic. And so that, there are educators, because, many, well, no, all of, and I think this is in terms of, as well as that chance kind of couple of days in this kind of coaching performance weird thing, what wasn't weird thing, but where I went and did the 2-day CPD, is, of course, all my discussions with professional dancers, and all the professional dancers that have come on to the programs that I manage, an absolutely shared, it can be seen as anecdotal because I don't note it down, but in interviewing and talking with those dancers, the reason that they want to teach is because not only do they want to give back in terms of the rich knowledge and, all the tradition and the rich knowledge that's been passed down to them, but actually they want to change what the experience is in the studio for young dancers.
And it's sad to hear, isn't it? Because see what you say like that. I mean, that happens in football as well. It happens in dance, most sports, and it always happens with good intention, because having a curriculum, it's good in many ways because it keeps practice focused and this and that, but it doesn't prohibit like organic coaching. Like I always think, like sometimes I see a little bit more novice coaches where it is about content and getting through the content, but we need to stop seeing the content or the curriculum maybe at a more macro level as the be all and end all of coaching. Like we should be able to plan 2 or 3 exercises with the empowerment to stick to exercise 1 if there's a real potent, meaningful, because it comes down to what is coaching. Is coaching, this is sort of through our conversation, and I think I started to see this in the text as well, Denny, is I was like, coaching is about meaningful moments. It might be about how we capture the most meaningful moments at any one time, and that doesn't naturally harmonise with curriculum and the pressures of time, because it's just that I see it all the time, isn't it? That like if you just it resonates a lot of things. You say that, because I'm like, that happens everywhere.
But it's so interesting. As you're saying that's making me think about those moments. As coaches, as teachers, sometimes we don't have a control over when that might happen for the individuals that are in front of us. But obviously what we do have control over is how we are facilitating, how we are managing the learning environment as one that encourages, that sense of empowerment and, decision making, that the student, the dancer, and their decision making. And it's just making me think, it's also making me think, you're helping me advance my thinking. I think it's advancing, I don't know, is that if I'm in a teaching role, but actually something happens for a dancer that creates a new moment for them, then something has happened that is coaching related, even though I may have been within a teaching role. Perhaps because if I'm within a teaching role, mindful of the way that I'm teaching and the pedagogy and the approaches, and being flexible in not having to, I think it's, one of the things that has come out of a lot of the analysis that I've been doing from the data collection is the dancer as product, not process. And being really mindful of the process.
And you can probably keep me the same terminology we're using. You're probably able to coach to teach as well, isn't you? Because the whole idea of allowing dancers to explore their own movement, that could be the movement solution. Like we sometimes in coaching, we talk about about like, ecological dynamic view and things, and how we're trying to kind of understand the affordances that are presented within our environment, or even within our own bodily frame. You know, dance being very postural to help us achieve an outcome or get around an issue in some other way. Now, again, there's another camp that just is more talking about the specific condition practices or whatever, but if we want to encourage people, and maybe again encourage a dancer to figure out how to better perform a choreography, like sometimes I would imagine they need a stimulus where they're encouraged to actually find out their own way of getting around their own constraints. If it's a physical constraint, a psychological constraint, but it's still within a rigid, more structured environment, but it's still they're taking ownership of it, isn't it? And they're becoming part of the process towards the product, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And also working with them so that, because I think there's very much a culture of correction in dance. And again, then that kind of, I've got to force my body into this kind of aesthetic, but to actually be accepting of, okay, yeah, in terms of there are natural physics, I say constraints, you know, in terms of turnout, you know, dancers will have different natural turnout, and that's all to do with skeletal, you know, they don't have control over that. What they do have control over is how they manage that. And if they actually manage that correctly and apply, rather than trying to push something to look a certain way so it distorts, which then eventually ends up in an if you can work with a dancer to actually work within that and explore the potential of that, then actually I think what you see is you'll see somebody who maybe doesn't have as natural a degree of turnout as another dancer, but will look like they have because they are working with it truthfully and honestly.
And is that sort of what you said the phrase holistic technique? Is that kind of what that is? Is that what that's owing towards, or is that a slightly different thing?
I think, yeah, as I said that, I was like, I think what I mean by that is we can get, in dance, we can get kind of stuck on the physical technique, but there is the performance technique, the musicality, the dynamic, the quality of a movement as well. And I think there can be, and I think in the way that, I'm probably am I making assumptions? But I think where we've been with what is available now for students to access online in terms of performances and photographs, and you know there is this, and it is being talked about a lot in terms of, I want to get my leg here, I need to do this, I need to, you know, so I need to look a certain way, I need to be able to do a certain move, and that can be really challenging. A lot of educators are talking about how they're, you know, dancers coming in, we need to look like this, need to look like that. You know, there's a lot of benefit in a lot of the resources that are out there if they're used carefully and they're used well. So I think educators are also kind of battling. Yeah, I think some would say they are battling that. In terms of also, I think, and I'm thinking about, you know, particular sectors where students and parents have an expectation that if their child is going to dance, they are going to look like this.
Yeah, and you know what, I mean, it's a very sensible comment, and I remember reading it as well in the paper we were talking about, it seemed like you were giving an insight into some of the sort of psychosocial or psychological sort of issues that some dancers have, if it's not just around comparisons, because like maybe 20 years ago or 10 years ago, I could imagine a dance student has herself or himself and everyone else in the room to compare themselves with. Now they have a million people to compare themselves with, because in an information age, they just need to go onto their phone, and that is both. It's like everything. There's a love to that, and that there can be more inspiration, but there's also a curse of just the insecurities that brings, and then the aesthetic elements of, you know, the fabrication often of online stuff. I know body image to be an issue, and all these things probably now necessitate an upgrading on how we manage them, and I think that's where your paper, I think, offers a real contemporary view on dance, because it clearly can't be taught, and I think in the same ways even mass sport or other sports can't really be taught now in the same way they were taught previous years. If anything, not just because of, but also because of the fact that young people nowadays are in a totally different world from us. So the world has to be seen as something we have to guard them from, but also news, but be sensible around that. I mean, if you could elaborate on that further, I suppose, and how you've taken that into this sort of framework for dance, because I thought that was quite a powerful view on things.
It's really interesting, because I'm not sure I'm going to directly answer your question, but whilst you were speaking, I was thinking about, one of the other drivers for the research was, and it was a crystallizing experience for me, as a young dancer, where I was very aware of my own self-talk and how people always tell me now, oh, you're very reflective. You're a very reflective person. When people told me, I was like, am I? I have no idea. I'm just the way I am. But when I then think back, I realized that I was very reflective, but I wasn't ever taught to be reflective. It wasn't part of my training, even my education within, formal education. It wasn't part of that. And I heard, you hear along the way, that student's, that person's really talented, but they haven't got what it takes. And it really, somewhere along the line with the research, it made me just kind of think, what does that they don't have what it takes mean? And is it that actually, if they were encouraged and to develop their reflective practice and their intrapersonal skills, might they actually have been equipped with what it takes? Because I think people who are resilient are probably resilient through their own ability or the ability of others to help them through adversity. Yeah, but some people aren't. Some people don't. They can be quite lost. Perhaps, I don't know.
Not 100%. I mean, look, we even talk about, I mean, I've worked with players in the past that as young kids, like even from a developmental standpoint, like a young kid can't look at the future at 11 years old in the same way a young adult at 19 can. Maybe they can look a year in advance. They can't work back from a 7 year plan. So, like, again, what are you setting them up to fail if you say you're not guiding them on how do you set targets? What sort of targets do you set? How does the targets you set inform what you should be thinking about after a dance class? If you're not giving them that guidelines, like, it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're obviously going to fail, and then you're going to say that they just didn't have what it takes, and then that's just going to perpetuate. It's like...
But I also think that goal setting or targets or whatever we kind of refer to them as, we have to be really sensitive about how we work with students. People will sort of say, oh, well, we get corrections during class, and then at the end of a term, we'll get feedback from our tutor. And it's like, okay, surely everything is feedback. Yes. And it'll be a kind of, a 20-minute session where it's like, okay, well, from the feedback, what goals are you going to set for yourself? If we have time, when we've got 20 students, but 20 students in one class, but then 20 students in the next class and the next class, how are we really making sure that we follow up on that enough in a meaningful, purposeful way for each individual? And I think that for me is where I think, and I'm kind of maybe going off piece, but a bit here, but I imagine we have it in sport you have it in sport as well, is that with dance alongside the technique class, now there's much more, particularly in vocational training, where strength and conditioning coaching will happen outside of the technique class. But that's physiological strength and conditioning. Where is psychological strength and conditioning happening is my question. And I think that educators and teachers, it's falling on them. So alongside having to teach this and teach that and make sure and get through the curriculum, that they're actually having to manage that side of things. And I think that there needs to be the equivalent of the physiological strength and conditioning to the psychological strength and conditioning. That isn't, because when you look at strength and conditioning, those students will have individual strength and conditioning plans because of their own physiology. And what is happening is students with vocational training, they might have performance psychology.
And
I think that's a different thing to actually working in a more intimate way with a student in terms of taking what they've been doing in the studio and exploring that through a coaching perspective.
Yeah, I suppose the optics of what I could presume to be like a dance studio or in a sports club or organisation, the optics of having different levels of staff doing different activities. To the outside looking in, it looks like, whoa, that's very integrated and this and that. But it's not actually it's not concurrent thinking, like in the sense of we need to, what ultimately you better dancing from dancing. So like it's the most functional, it's the most relevant, it's the most practice specific activity you can do. And how are we actually pulling in what are supportive mechanisms into the activity itself? And then that's more of a holistic. And I think you've landed on that as well, Dennie. It's like, it's always one thing to ask, like, because sometimes I think coach education or teacher education, it sometimes feels like we're asking them to do another thing. Here's another thing, another thing. But actually, maybe it's more at a system level then. We have to make room for, even if it's more cohesive thought, even if it's more integrated thought, we still need to take away other pressures like time, curriculum, heavily set, rigid, you need to get through this in whatever term. We have to allow space for more of the organic, or at least space for more of the most impactful activity that can occur to occur. What I was quite interested, I wanted to come back, before we move on to kind of getting a bit of an insight into the practice framework that you then made. I know we've kind of touched on a little bit to kind of crystallise that a little bit. I did want to come back to one thing you mentioned a little bit earlier. I thought it was really interesting, and it's something I'm constantly kind of grappling with, and I'm quite curious to see how it's been giving you mind fog probably as well. You mentioned about like when the genie's out the ball. So see how that idea, like I always think about this because when you move from, or not necessarily move, but when you have that sort of epiphany, I think, of I've done this in one way, and now I'm realising there's another way of doing that. What has certainly been the case for me, and I wonder if this is at all similar to your own experience, or I don't know. But when you've then figured out that, you know what, giving them 5, 6, 7, 8 different instructions they keep in their head at one time, that has an impact on flow. To then change your approach, okay, and then knowing that is a helpful benefit, does that ever then make you shy about returning to the more scripted, more directive approach? Or do we, because there's a train of thought to say that if you know there's another way, and that if we see things about holistic exploration and this and that by that standard we need to make everything of the same ilk? Or do you feel there is still a need to consider the timings of things? But I just mean in the sense, us as teachers or as coaches, we understand the separation of thought, but I think as an athlete or as a dancer, as an athlete, we can't always trust that they're able to flex in the same way, because you either are just totally in your head or you're totally not. And to be given mixed messaging a lot, is that actually less helpful than to be given constant of any one type of messaging? I wonder, what's your thoughts on that? This isn't an answer I'm asking.
No,
this is tough.
As you're saying it, I'm writing down shared mental models. I can hear my supervisor Pam sort of saying, like, yes, Pam. But going back on, I don't think you bring up a number of different things, because I think, that people, I think when you found a different way, that you're sort of saying the other way was wrong. I don't think I'm not at all. I think there's, in regard to all the different, all the different things that in dance, and how we teach and how we learn and how we train and how we coach, it's all needed. So it isn't about saying that is wrong, that is bad. I think there's more of this done. The stuff it's kind of. So I'm trying to sort my thoughts out, because also it comes back to when we talk about time. Is that actually sometimes get through this. Well, actually, if you just focus on one thing, you might get through the other things much quicker in the next session. So it's kind of understanding that kind of and that made me think of the tortoise and the hare. But I think one of the things that I have found myself working on when I work with students, and And this is about that shared mental model of explaining to students, being upfront with the upfront sort of laying out with the students, okay, we are together for a semester, and across this semester, we know what the assessment is going to be. How we get there, the process is, there's going to be a process of teaching, of training, and of coaching. Mm-hmm. This is how I see teaching. This is how I would approach training. This is how I would approach coaching. Any thoughts, discussion around that. And then I will...
And is that so that they are able to understand that you continue to use that different language of teaching, coaching, this, they know, right?
Yes,
we're training today.
A shared understanding and kind of creating a shared mental model. So they know where I'm coming from. Hopefully I understand what they understand because we've discussed that together. So that then, and I think this is what I said to the students, I know that as an educator, I should be saying, these are the learning outcomes and da-da-da-da-da. I've moved away from be very clear in terms of I know in my mind what we might need to have covered in a particular class, but I'm not, if we don't get there, I'm able to reflect on and think about how I then manage the next session in terms of how we get to the final, yes, there is an assessment, so there is a goal. But I will I'm lucky I have fantastic sort of smart screens at the RED where I can go in and say, right, this is the content I'm hoping we're going to get through today, or we're going to cover that is going to be within this particular class. And, if we're in week 3, it may be, okay, exercise 1, this, we learned that last week. And actually, I might have explained at the end of a class, okay, I've taught this. By next week, I expect you to know it so that we can train it. Mm-hmm. So that there's a point further down the line where we can coach it. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to be really explicit with the students as to where my motivation as an educator in the students, in the studio, comes from. Also, I think to help student understanding of how we're working together. And then sometimes within that, depending on what we're doing, if we're looking at, we're doing a particular, and I might even put an instruction on the whiteboard, 20 minutes, while they're doing the 20-minute warm-up, make sure you've gone over this exercise. And so as they're warming up, they'll be sort of reminding themselves, because then I might talk to them and say, with this particular exercise, okay, what technical information have you been given? Going back to the goal, what technical information have you been given about? What do you know about this technically? Yeah, what is your level of expertise? Because they are developing their expertise, every moment that they're in the studio and not in the studio, but reflecting on it. And then I might sort of say, okay, if we were to think about 3 options, 3 different things that could be useful to be aware of whilst you're doing them, what might they be? I might have prescribed those at one class because we've not done it before, but the next class I may ask them. I write them on the board and then I'll say, okay, and I might peer them up, okay, choose one of those options, but don't tell your partner. The partner they watches each other, and then they have a discussion to kind of see if they have observed the particular decision that they've made of the thing that they're working on. And that takes time, but further down the line, that's a more natural process for them.
Plus, it seems like a pretty actionable blueprint you're given there for how we can try to individualise the process as best we can, even when working with a large group. Because one of the things, like, straight away as you're saying that, because I completely agree, particularly with learning outcomes, where there's the risk of, if you set learning outcomes for people, sometimes you do, as you just said, if it's introducing a topic or whatever. But I always think if you set a learning outcome, sometimes you can restrict and overly bound what conversations could come out of the session as it runs, because of that class of 20 students, we can't presume that each one of them has the same experience in the choreography. So it's like, I could imagine, like, could I have it with players? If I do a session on passing, for one player, the session is about passing because they have the ball more. For other players, the session wasn't about passing, so their learning outcomes were totally different because they didn't have the ball as much. It was about defending. And I always think, how can we reach people at scale, because it's hard. You've got a full group. But I like that idea, if it's not just peer coaching, or if it's just sometimes having that dialogue with them beyond a certain point. So it's like, it seems like a really great, very tangible way for a coach that's listening to access what you're saying, Denny, and use that, because you're given structure, but there's freedom and there's individuality within that. And I think a lot of sports struggle with that. Dance obviously being a culprit sometimes of being very dictatorial and stuff like that. But I just think that's excellent. I'm curious on now, I know it's been a bit build up for this, which is great, but we're chatting about all this stuff at the same time. But so you then arrived at your sort of now the practice framework. Now, this didn't so much come out of findings as much as it was a model for instruction. Is that correct? But I know that obviously there's a lot of times elapsed since the publication. So give me a bit of a description.
Kind of like rather than a model, I kind of see it more as a kind of framework. I think because all this thinking was going on, and it was like, okay, but how do I focus all of that? Kind of that kind of, you go out and then you need to focus in, and you go out and you focus in, and I don't know, it's one of those, you wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning and you can't switch your head off.
Yeah.
And it was like, right, okay, fair enough. And so I just started to write down all of these things. And I think alongside that, I was aware of where I'd been sort of doing coaching training that was dealing with SMART goals and, the GROW model, and that there was various, the ABCDE model. So, that kind of coaching that came out of cognitive behavioral coaching. It was what is there, in terms of all the things that I was writing down, is there a word that would help me kind of consolidate all of that thinking? And that's where practice came from, but practice with the S, with that S. And I use it as a bigger S, which initially I kind of thought, okay, we're all talking about the studio as a safe space and, safe practice. But I think one of the things that has not shifted, because I think absolutely anywhere should be a safe space, but where all my data collection and research and interviews and the analysis has really brought me to is intrapersonal intelligence and interpersonal intelligence, and that being related to the self. And so I think that's where the biggest, not shift, but where I'm aware of in terms of, if I were to look at that now, yes, I've also, for myself, not as part of my not direct, case studies for my PhD, but in terms of my own teaching practice, is that I have sat, particularly with teaching choreography, is I have sat, over one semester and developed a supplementary scheme of work based on reflective practice. So where there may be the choreographic scheme of work in terms of this week we're going to do this, and in preparation for next week I need you to look at this or look at that. I also developed for students, because part of their assessment is a student-led discussion about creating choreography. I said, you don't have to do it. It's not part of this, but I've developed a scheme of work based on reflective exercises.
And what was the response to that in terms of since you put it out?
Well, I'm in the third year of doing it now, and I think students, one of the things is that the student-led discussions improve, but I can't, that's anecdotal in terms of, I think their reflection really helped them in terms of their student-led discussions. But for me, I also said to myself, right, I am going to do a series of reflective exercises after each of these sessions. And I documented those. And from that, I extracted or kind of analysed it in terms of what I was writing and how that mapped to the practice framework. So now, where I've got sort of practice framework, as I might have process and performance, but underneath that, I've got a whole load of other P's and a whole load of other R's. But they don't need to be put there. I just kind of know that they all weave into that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I know obviously, I suppose we don't need to necessarily do this in the paper, which is for brevity, I suppose, but we've spoke a lot around some of the points already: safe space, empowerment, individuality, talent development. Your focus on coaching pedagogy and bringing that into dance.
Yeah.
That sort of. Could you clarify this one? There was one element I was quite curious about, Dennie, around awareness, agency, autonomy. Can you describe what was that getting at? We've got the clog metaphor, practice and dance and teacher.
I think the awareness was definitely related to the inner game and not technical instructions, but dancers being aware.
Okay, just aware. Yeah, sorry.
Awareness rather than, but I think also awareness in relation to that kind of what would I say in terms of where the I don't want to say the locus of control, but where control sits, whether the what's it of change, the element of change, where that sits with a teacher. And then, what sits with a teacher, that element of change sits with a teacher, and that element of change that sits with the ownership. Sorry. Yeah. So the ownership of change might sit with a teacher, and when you're coaching, the ownership of change actually sits with the individual.
Okay, so that shift in power.
That kind of awareness of that I think then leads to, intrinsic to that is then a sense of autonomy and agency.
Yeah, and people.
The answer is working.
Yeah. Plus, I know it's a conversation for another time, but I know that autonomy and coming to motivation to actually continue to be there, because that's the thing, isn't it? People, and this is across dance, but also other sports and coaching. Like, we forget that we need to inspire people to want to come back. Like, sometimes we overlook trying to get the most effective coaching session in the world. Then we forget, how do we actually make this stimulating enough that they want to partake in it again? Because that is such an important thing. You're a salesman to the endeavour, while also trying to be a teacher to the process. In a sense, that's what you're trying to kind of manage those things at once. Then I'm conscious, obviously, of your time. If I could challenge you to maybe, we talk a lot in the show about, we're trying to bring this a little segment in now where we're talking about coaching hats. So if I was to challenge you to kind of summarise our conversation today into sort of 3 main sort of little bits of information that coaches or teachers, whatever way we want to think of ourselves, and this is at the moment, we know it's fluid, that's something that's came out of this conversation. If you want to take something away, some advice away that we can implement tomorrow, what would it be? Even if it's at the starting point of something that's a longer term endeavour, what would you say?
Oh, I don't know. So I've kind of written, I know that very, very close to my heart is interpersonal intelligence and reflection. But I think that, and I think I've mentioned them all, is that ownership of change. And, as an educator, really thinking about where the ownership of change sits and how that shifts. Because I think and equally, I talked about it, and, the understanding of shared mental models, not presuming that students understand, not presuming that we even understand ourselves or what we're talking about, but, that dialogue develops. I think that dialogue in terms of developing understanding or unpacking understanding, because that can help us understand where people may be thinking very, very differently. Or you makes us realise, oh gosh, well, what I assumed they understood, I was completely, far from the mark. So that and that then that developing the decision making, that process of how to facilitate a session where, I know that we're always making decisions, but where through that the process of working, how students are developing their decision making is a way that is supported and productive. Do I mean productive? Because I could put safe into that, because they could be making decisions that are, I don't want to say rational, because that makes it sound all, but because creativity's got to come into it. But I think sometimes dancers can make decisions where actually they're being very hard on themselves and very cruel to themselves. So they're making decisions that enable them to be creative, that enable them to grow, enable them to continue to enjoy what they're doing. They have ownership over that, but that there's still that, if they're coming to sessions, it's because they have a belief in and a trust of the coach or the person that they're working with.
Yeah, and little wonder that some maybe are a bit overly critical when the teaching or coaching process within dancing's probably for a lot of years has been overly mechanistic and quite, it always sounds like if you've got a faulty part in a car, you take it out. It's very, we're forgetting there's a human in that. So amazing. I love, actually, I think what you've given is that's a bit unique, Dennie, is that these are more like free reflective points, which is cool because this is a thinking conversation and I think that's really good. I like that kind of change of pace. I said this is actually another additional question I did have, sorry.
Right.
I'm just curious, are we getting anywhere? So have you seen dance? Are you alone in your thinking? Or are you seeing this, is this starting to grow? Is dance evolving? Or are we still somewhere that we...
No, I'm not alone in my thinking. I think the way that I express it might be different in terms of the way that I use the word coaching, but I'm beginning to have those discussions with people like our artistic director within the organisation, comes from that very traditional field of dance coaching. I think in terms of dance pedagogy, and there is an advancement that as teachers, educators are consistently trying to move from that reproduction to the production, and guided discovery, convergent to divergent. It's still working to kind of do that, but I think within the vocational setting and sometimes within the private sector, again to do with time, still there's still challenges. And I think that's, for me, that's where the sort of differentiating in my head that kind of really, some people kind of go, well, does it matter if they're, whether you call yourself a teacher, a trainer or a coach? For me, actually, yes, it does. It does matter because it helps me when I'm going into the studio in terms of how I work with students.
Yeah, and what's came out of this chat for me, Dennie, is, and why I just need to thank you so much for obviously producing this paper with your co-author, Pam Richards, is that you're not trying to replace anything, and I think that's what's great because it goes against the typical logic we have. And I think this is partly I'll speak just exclusively within the coaching world here, but I think we do have an element of I wouldn't say it's tribalistic, but we do often see everything outside of what we currently know or do as an enemy, and it's always about, are we trying to replace it? No, we're not. And I think what you have offered is a differentiation of moment-to-moment responsibility on the part of the person who is coaching or teaching or training. It's not at the expense of any other one of those modalities. It's just recognising the validity and the requirements of the vocation, and I think that's great. I think that's what we need to see more of. So, Dennie, thanks so much, obviously, for giving me so much of your time. And
well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, honestly. And for those that are listening, I hope the conversation has been as useful to you as it certainly has for me. So, yeah, we'll see you all next time.